stone was cold against my back as I pressed myself deeper into the ancient temple's alcove. 1971, Vietnam War. They never prepared us for this in basic training. When they sent us to fight the Viet Cong, I thought the enemy wore uniforms. I was wrong, dead wrong. My hands trembled around my M16 rifle, sweat making the metal grip slick despite the damp chill of the temple. The stench of rotting jungle mixed with something else, something ancient and wrong. Like death, but older. Much older. As we lost more ground each day in this endless war, I wondered if there were things in these jungles that our commanders didn't understand, threats they couldn't account for in their strategies. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in any soldier's war story, any jungle combat zone. It started as a low rumble, vibrating through the stone walls and rattling my dog tags. The sound grew into something between a tiger's roar and an elephant's trumpet, but twisted, unnatural. All my combat training, everything they taught us about containing communist expansion in Southeast Asia, meant nothing against this. Somewhere in the darkness, claws scraped against stone. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. The sound echoed through the temple corridors, making it impossible to tell which direction it came from. I tried controlling my breathing like they taught us in basic, but my lungs wouldn't cooperate. Each breath came in short, ragged gasps. A shadow moved across the wall ahead, something massive. My night vision had adjusted enough to see the ancient carvings on the walls, worn images of people running from something with wings and teeth. Now I knew why they carved those warnings. Now I knew what they were running from. Something wet dripped onto my shoulder from above. I didn't want to look up. I really didn't. But I did. Red eyes stared back at me from the darkness, and they were hungry. The memory of those red eyes haunts me. But let me back up. Let me tell you how we found that temple, and why I'll never sleep soundly again. 48 hours earlier, I was crammed into the belly of a C-130 transport plane, heading straight into what we called Indian country, military speak for enemy territory. The plane's metal frame groaned and shuddered as we hit another pocket of turbulent air over the Pacific. Around me, 24 other soldiers swayed in their seats like green uniformed pendulums. That's where I met David Chen and Tommy Parker. David sat to my right, a walking contradiction in olive drab, half Vietnamese, half Irish, and all soldiers. He was reading a letter, mouthing the words in Vietnamese before translating them under his breath to English. Tommy was across from us, barely 18 like me, a high school dropout from Austin who joined up because, in his words, beats working at my uncle's gas station. The plane hit another rough patch, and Tommy's face turned a shade greener. "If Charlie doesn't kill me, this flight might," he joked weakly. A few guys chuckled, but it was nervous laughter. We were all scared, just trying not to show it. David looked up from his letter, his expression serious. He switched to Vietnamese, speaking to an older soldier across the aisle. I watched their exchange, noticing how the older man's face darkened. When David turned back to me, something in his eyes had changed. "What was that about?" I asked. "He says where we're heading. There's something in the jungle that scares them more than Americans or Viet Cong." David paused, choosing his words carefully. "Something that hunts both sides." I laughed it off then. Just local superstition, I thought. The real monsters wore uniforms and carried AK-47s. God, I wish I'd been right. The warnings on that plane should have been our first clue. But when we landed in Saigon 2 days later, the heat and chaos drove everything else from our minds. The city hit us like a hammer, all noise, strange smells, and suffocating humidity. My uniform stuck to my back before I'd even left the airfield. David, Tommy, and I had a few hours before reporting to our unit. Might as well see the sights, David said, already comfortable in his role as our unofficial guide. The streets were a maze of vendors, scooters, and military vehicles. Locals stared at us, just more fresh American faces heading to the meat grinder. That's when I saw the bookstore. It was wedged between a noodle shop and what looked like an herb merchant, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Something about it pulled at me. Maybe it was the way locals hurried past it, or how the shadows seemed deeper in its doorway. "Hold up," I called to the others. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside, the sound oddly muffled in the heavy air. The smell hit me first. Old paper, incense, and something musty I couldn't place. Books lined every wall, most with Vietnamese titles I couldn't read. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman. Mai, I'd later learn her name. She watched me with eyes that had seen too much. When David followed me in, she straightened, spoke rapidly in Vietnamese. "She says we shouldn't be here," David translated, but I was already moving toward a section that caught my eye. There, on a shelf of worn books, sat an English volume, its spine cracked and faded. The moment I touched it, the air seemed to grow colder. The book fell open to a page with an illustration that stopped my breath. A creature with wings like a bat, scales like a serpent, and eyes that seemed to glow even on the yellowed paper. Below it, text described something that haunted the deep jungle, something that demanded sacrifice. Mai appeared beside me so suddenly I nearly dropped the book. Her English was heavily accented but clear. "You go to jungle soon, yes?" When I nodded, her face tightened. "Then you listen. In jungle, old things wait. Older than war. When you hear wings in night, when you see eyes in dark, you run. You understand? You run." Tommy laughed nervously from the doorway. "Come on, man. We're gonna be late." I closed the book, but Mai's hand shot out, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. "Dragon not like American bombs," she said. "Dragon not care which side you fight. Dragon only want feed." Outside, the Saigon heat hit me like a wall, but I couldn't shake the chill from the bookstore. David was unusually quiet as we walked to the base. When I asked what else Mai had said, he just shook his head. "Some things," he muttered, "are better not translated. I'd remember those words later, in the temple. I'd remember them when we heard the wings." 3 days after the bookstore incident, we got our first taste of the jungle. Our unit moved out at dawn, the morning mist still clinging to the trees like ghost shrouds. Sergeant Martinez led our patrol, 12 men total, including me, David, and Tommy. The dense foliage swallowed us whole, turning daylight into permanent twilight. "Keep your intervals," Martinez whispered, his voice carrying just far enough. "Charlie loves ambush points like this." We moved in formation, M16 at the ready, each man 5 meters apart. The jungle had its own heartbeat, a rhythm of insects, birds, and things we couldn't name. The humidity was worse under the canopy. Every breath felt like drinking warm soup. Our boots squelched in the mud, and vines seemed to reach for us like hungry fingers. I kept thinking about Mai's warning, about dragons in the darkness. But in the green-tinted daylight, those fears felt foolish. Then we found the first signs. "Sarge," Tommy called out softly, kneeling by a fallen tree. "You need to see this." The claw marks were massive, 3 parallel gouges ripped deep into the hardwood, each groove wide enough to fit my hand. Martinez frowned, running his fingers along the marks. "Could be a tiger," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. David shook his head, speaking low in Vietnamese to himself. The local language made the jungle sounds pause, like even the birds were listening. "Not tiger," he finally said. "Too big, too high up tree." He pointed upward where similar marks scored the trunk 15 feet above our heads. "Whatever did this, it climbs." We found more signs as we pushed deeper into the jungle. Trees stripped of bark in impossible places. The remains of what might have been a deer, but torn apart in ways that didn't make sense. And the silence, periods where every natural sound just stopped. That's when we heard the first gunshots. "Contact front," Martinez shouted. The jungle erupted with AK-47 fire. We scattered for cover, training kicking in. I dove behind a massive root system, my heart thundering in my chest. Through the chaos, I caught glimpses of black-clad figures moving through the trees. Viet Cong. We traded fire, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The air filled with gun smoke and the sharp smell of cordite. But something was wrong. The VC weren't pressing their advantage. They seemed more interested in retreating than fighting. And their faces, in the brief moments I could see them, showed fear. Not of us. "They're running," someone shouted. Martinez started to give orders for pursuit, but a sound cut him off. High above the canopy, something moved, something big. The branches swayed against the wind, and a shadow passed overhead, too fast to track. Both sides stopped firing. For a moment, Americans and VC alike stood frozen, eyes turned skyward. In the sudden silence, we heard it. A sound like leather wings unfurling, followed by a low rumble that made the ground tremble. The VC melted back into the jungle, not charging, not retreating, fleeing. "Back to base," Martinez ordered, his voice tight. "Now!" No one argued. As we withdrew, I glanced back at the claw marks on the tree. In the fading light, they seemed to glisten, fresh cut. Whatever made them wasn't far away, and I had a sickening feeling it was hunting us all. The jungle played tricks on you after a while. The constant green twilight, the shifting shadows, the way distance seemed to bend. So, when we first saw the temple, I thought it was another illusion. We'd been tracking the VC for 2 days since our first contact, following a trail that made less sense with each passing hour. Their boot prints would suddenly stop, replaced by signs of panic, dropped weapons, scattered supplies, and once, a blood trail that went up a tree and didn't come down. "Hold up," David called out, his voice barely above a whisper. Through a break in the foliage, gray stone walls rose like ancient bones from the jungle floor. Vines crawled across carved surfaces, but couldn't quite hide the massive scale of the structure. The entrance gaped like an open mouth, dark and uninviting. "Martinez won't believe this," Tommy muttered, but Martinez was already approaching, his usual confident stride hesitant. "Chen," he ordered, "you read any of this?" He gestured to the symbols carved around the entrance. David moved closer, brushing away vines to reveal more of the ancient writing. His face, usually composed, grew increasingly troubled as he translated. "It's old, very old," he said. "Talks about offerings, sacrifices." His fingers traced the worn characters. "Says this was built as a feeding ground? No, a feeding temple, for something they called..." He switched to Vietnamese, the words sounding like stones falling into deep water. "English, Chen," Martinez prompted. "The wing in shadow," David translated. "But there's more. Warnings about blood price and eternal hunger. And this part..." He paused, swallowing hard. "Says it comes when armies clash. Feeds on the conflict. The more violence, the more it hungers." A cold breeze drifted from the temple's mouth, carrying a smell like old meat and something else, something that reminded me of the bookstore in Saigon. My mind flashed to Mai's warning about dragons and running. Martinez made the call to investigate. Standard sweep pattern, buddy system. The temple's interior was a maze of corridors and chambers, our flashlight beams catching glimpses of more carvings, horrible scenes of winged shapes and fleeing figures. In what must have been the main chamber, our lights revealed a massive altar. Dark stains marked the stone, too old to be recent but impossible to ignore. Above it, a skylight opened to the jungle canopy, though something about the angle seemed wrong, like it was designed to let something in rather than illuminate. "Sarge," Tommy called out, his light fixed on a far wall. "You need to see this." The wall was covered in handprints, hundreds of them, pressed in what could only be blood. Some looked centuries old, others could have been made yesterday. David moved closer to read the text surrounding the handprints. His flashlight beam trembled slightly. "Says these are signatures," he explained, "of the survivors. Each mark is someone who..." His voice trailed off. "Someone who what?" Martinez demanded. "Someone who saw it and lived. They left these as warnings." David's light picked out fresh claw marks scoring the ancient stone. "And as prayers that it wouldn't come back." A distant sound echoed through the corridors, something between a screech and a roar. Everyone's lights snapped toward the entrance. In the silence that followed, we could hear something massive moving through the jungle outside. The sound of wings unfurling, the scrape of claws on stone. Martinez's order was barely a whisper. "Nobody move." In that moment, standing in the ancient feeding temple of something older than war itself, I realized Mai had been right. The dragon didn't care what uniform you wore, and we had just walked into its lair. The temple's shadows stretched long across the jungle floor as we took up defensive positions outside. None of us wanted to stay near those blood-marked walls, but we needed to regroup, to make sense of what we'd found. That's when we saw him, a lone VC soldier, his black uniform torn and muddy, sneaking through the undergrowth. David spotted him first. Our ambush was perfect, textbook. 3 of us surrounded him before he could reach for his weapon. No shots fired. The fear in his eyes wasn't for us, though. "Bind his hands," Martinez ordered, but kept his voice low. Something about this place made everyone whisper. "Chen, see what he knows." The prisoner sat trembling against a fallen tree, eyes darting between the temple entrance and the darkening sky. David knelt in front of him, speaking soft, rapid Vietnamese. The man's response was urgent, almost pleading. "He says his unit was tracking us," David translated, "but something's been tracking them." More questions, more desperate answers. The prisoner's voice cracked as he described what happened to his squad. Through David's translation, a nightmare emerged. "Says it started 3 days ago. His unit, 30 men strong, was moving south along the river. At night, they heard wings. Then the screaming started." David paused, listening to more. "Each night, more men disappeared, not just killed, taken up into the trees. Sometimes they found pieces." Martinez's jaw tightened. "Ask him about the other missing patrols." "The POWs?" David asked. The prisoner laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "He says there are no POWs, not here. Says both sides have lost men. Says the thing in the temple." David hesitated. "Says it's been waiting for the war, all the fighting, the death. It's like a dinner bell." "How many of his unit are left?" I asked. David posed the question. The prisoner's answer was a single word that needed no translation. "0. A twig snapped in the jungle behind us. Everyone spun, weapons raised. The prisoner started babbling, trying to break free of his restraints. "What's he saying?" Martinez demanded. David's face went pale. "He says it hunts at sunset. Says we need to..." A shadow passed overhead, massive wings blotting out the fading sunlight. The prisoner screamed something, the same words I'd heard in Mai's bookstore. Before anyone could stop him, he broke free and ran, not toward the jungle's safety, but straight into the temple. "Stop him," Martinez ordered, but we all heard it, that terrible screech from above. The prisoner's scream cut off abruptly. When we reached the temple entrance, there was nothing but a few drops of blood and the echoing sound of something large moving through the temple's upper chambers. We found his restraints later, torn like paper. Nothing else. David stood staring at the temple's dark entrance. He said something else, he muttered. At the end. What? Said we made a mistake coming here. Said this place isn't a temple. David turned to me, his face ashen. It's a feeding ground, and we're the bait. The sun dipped lower, darkness creeping in. Soon it would be night. And now we knew. That's when it liked to hunt. After losing the prisoner, Martinez ordered us to set up a defensive perimeter around the temple entrance. None of us wanted to go back inside, but the thick jungle offered no better options. The sunset bled red through the canopy as we took our positions, the humid air growing heavier with approaching night. 2-hour watch rotations, Martinez whispered. No one stands guard alone. He paired me with David, positioning us behind a fallen stone column, with a clear view of both the temple entrance and the surrounding jungle. The first hour passed in tense silence. Darkness crept in like rising water, until even the temple was just a darker shape against the night sky. The jungle's usual chorus of insects and frogs had gone quiet, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Except, sometimes, the movement above didn't match the wind. "You hear that?" David whispered, gripping his M16 tighter. I nodded. A sound like heavy silk dragging across stone came from somewhere above us. Tommy and his watch partner, Rodriguez, were shadows against the opposite wall, their heads tilted upward, tracking something we couldn't quite see. A peculiar scratching started, like giant claws testing the stone. It moved around the temple's upper levels, circling our position. My mouth went dry as I remembered the prisoner's last words about being bait. Then we saw it. Just a glimpse, but enough to make my blood run cold. A shape darker than the surrounding night moved across the temple's face. The moonlight caught scales that seemed to shift color like oil on water. Something that might have been a tail or a serpentine neck coiled around a stone outcropping. Jesus, David breathed. It's bigger than I thought. The shape moved again, and this time we saw the wings. Vast, membranous things that could easily wrap around a man. They unfurled partially, testing the night air. A sound emerged from above, not quite a growl, not quite a hiss, but something ancient and hungry that made every primitive part of my brain scream, "Run!" Rodriguez must have felt the same urge. We heard him moving before we could stop him. I can't do this," he stammered, breaking position. "Rodriguez," Martinez hissed, "get back in formation." But Rodriguez was running, blind panic carrying him toward the jungle. He made it 3 steps into the darkness. The sound that came next. I've been in combat, heard men die, but nothing like this. There was a rush of air, like a massive blade swinging down, then a wet, tearing noise. Rodriguez's scream cut off in a gurgle. When we aimed our flashlights into the jungle, there was nothing. No body, no blood trail, just disturbed leaves slowly settling back to earth, and the lingering echo of massive wings beating the air. Above us, something crunched. A sound like a giant cat purring rumbled through the stone. Then silence again, but worse, because now we knew it was up there, watching, waiting. "It's toying with us," David whispered. His hands were shaking so bad I could hear his dog tags rattling, like a cat with mice. The night stretched ahead of us, long and dark. Every shadow might be a wing, every sound those claws coming closer. We had our orders to hold position until dawn. I just prayed we'd live to see it. Dawn never came. Instead, gunfire ripped through the pre-morning darkness, shattering our terror-filled vigil. The VC had found us, dozens of them emerging from the jungle like shadows coming alive. Their first volley caught Tommy in the leg, spinning him behind a stone pillar. "Contact! Multiple hostiles!" Martinez's voice carried over the chaos. "Return fire! Maintain positions!" The temple courtyard erupted into a storm of bullets and muzzle flashes. I pressed against my column, firing short bursts at the muzzle flashes in the jungle. The familiar rhythm of combat should have been comforting. This was the enemy we'd trained for, after all. But something felt wrong about their attack. They seemed desperate, almost reckless, like they were running from something worse. David shouted over the gunfire, translating their yells. "They're not trying to kill us. They're trying to get into the temple." He was right. The VC were pushing forward, but not in an attack pattern. They were fleeing, using suppressing fire to clear a path to the temple entrance. That's when we heard it. That familiar leathery sound of wings unfurling, but closer now. Much closer. A scream cut through the gunfire, drawing every eye upward. One of the VC soldiers was rising into the air, kicking and thrashing in the grip of something we could barely see in the darkness. Then the shadows shifted, and for the first time we saw it clearly. The creature was massive, its wingspan blocking out what little starlight remained. Scales shimmered like wet obsidian, and its serpentine neck ended in a head that was part dragon, part nightmare. But its eyes, God, its eyes were the worst, glowing red like hot coals, filled with an intelligence that was ancient and utterly alien. The battlefield froze. Both sides watched in horror as the beast tore its prey apart, blood raining down on friend and foe alike. Then chaos erupted. Real chaos, not the organized violence of before. Everyone was firing at the creature now, tracer rounds lighting up the night like deadly fireworks. The bullets seemed to irritate it more than hurt it. It dropped what remained of its victim and dove into the midst of a VC squad, claws extended. The screams. I'll hear those screams until I die. Fall back, Martinez ordered. Everyone into the temple. The absurdity of taking shelter in the monster's lair wasn't lost on me, but we had no choice. I grabbed Tommy, hauling him up as David covered us. VC soldiers who were trying to kill us moments ago now ran alongside us, everyone unified by pure terror. The creature swooped again, snatching 2 men, 1 American, 1 VC, in a single pass. Their screams faded as it carried them up into the darkness. Blood dripped down like warm rain. We made it to the temple entrance, a bizarre mix of US troops and VC stumbling through the doorway. The creature's roar shook the very stone around us, and I heard the heavy impact of its landing on the temple roof. "Deeper," Martinez shouted. "Get deeper into the temple." As we ran into the darkness, I remembered what David had said about this place being a feeding ground. We weren't finding shelter. We were running exactly where it wanted us to go. The deeper corridors of the temple swallowed us like a stone throat. Our ragged group, a mix of Americans and VC thrown together by terror, staggered through the darkness, guided only by flashlight beams and fear. Tommy's weight grew heavier against my shoulder, his leg bleeding badly from the gunshot wound. "Keep moving," I gasped, feeling his grip weakening. "Stay with me, Tommy." Behind us, the creature's roars echoed through the corridors, followed by the sounds of stone cracking. It was trying to dig its way in, like a massive cat fishing for mice in their holes. Each impact sent ancient dust raining down from the ceiling. "Here," David called out, directing us into what looked like a larger chamber. "We need to stop and check Tommy's wound." Martinez didn't like it, but he knew we couldn't keep running with a wounded man. 5 minutes, he ordered. "Chen, work something out with the VC. We need to know all the exits." I propped Tommy against a wall while David pulled out a field dressing. The flashlight beams revealed more of those bloody handprints on the walls, hundreds of them overlapping. Some looked fresh. "How bad?" Tommy asked through gritted teeth. "You'll live," David lied smoothly, tightening the bandage. The blood was already soaking through. A VC officer approached, speaking rapidly to David. Their conversation was tense but urgent. Above us, something massive moved across the temple roof, its weight making the whole structure groan. "He says there's another way out," David translated. "An old tunnel system, but..." He hesitated. "But what?" "But that's where they found the bones. Lots of bones. Old and new." A crash from the corridor we'd come through made the decision for us. Flashlight beams caught glimpses of scales, of claws reaching into the tunnel. Screams erupted as the creature snagged one of the VC soldiers, dragging him back into the darkness. "The tunnels," Martinez ordered. "Now!" I hoisted Tommy up, his face gray with pain and blood loss. As we stumbled after the others, I caught a final glimpse of the chamber. In the crossing flashlight beams, I saw more of those wall carvings, showing people fleeing into tunnels, while above them, a winged shape waited. Just like now, we were running deeper into the monster's lair, and somehow I knew that's exactly what it wanted. The tunnels were older than the temple itself, crude passages that seemed to wind down into the earth's bones. Our combined group had dwindled to maybe 15 men, American and VC alike. The sound of pursuit had faded, but none of us believed we'd escaped. The creature was too patient, too cunning for that. "Hold up," Martinez whispered, raising his fist. Our flashlight beams converged on what looked like a doorway ahead, its edges unnaturally smooth compared to the rough tunnel walls. Ancient symbols had been carved deep into the stone, similar to those we'd seen above, but cruder, more urgent. David studied them, his face growing paler in the artificial light. "These are different," he muttered. "Older. They're not warnings anymore, they're prayers, begging for mercy." Tommy's breathing had grown labored, each step clearly agony. As we helped him through the doorway, our lights revealed a chamber that made the horrors above look tame. The ceiling soared away into darkness, too high for our beams to reach. But the walls... God, the walls were lined with alcoves, each one holding bones, human bones, thousands of them, stretching up into the shadows. Some were ancient, others still had strips of uniform cloth clinging to them. In the center stood a massive stone altar, its surface stained almost black. Channels had been cut into the stone, leading to drains. The air felt thick with centuries of death. "It's a feeding chamber," David translated from one of the VC soldiers, "where they made offerings to keep it sleeping." A sound echoed from above, claws on stone, closer now. Much closer. We spread out, weapons pointed at the various entrances, but everyone knew bullets wouldn't save us. Not here. Not against that thing. Then we saw them. More carvings, but these told a story. They showed people placing sacrifices on the altar, and the creature sleeping, staying quiet, leaving them alone. "Look at the dates," David said, pointing to markings beside each carving. "They stretch back centuries. Every time armies came to these jungles, it woke up. Federal. The only way they stopped it was..." A massive impact shook the chamber, sending bones clattering from their alcoves. Another hit, and cracks appeared in the ceiling. The creature was digging its way down. "The only way they stopped it was what?" Martinez demanded. "Sacrifice," David whispered. "Willing sacrifice. Blood freely given." The ceiling exploded inward. Through the falling debris, something dark and massive dropped into the chamber. Wings spread, filling the space from wall to wall. That serpentine head rose up, red eyes fixing on our group with terrible intelligence. We opened fire, the muzzle flashes lighting up the chamber like strobes. The creature barely seemed to notice. Its tail whipped out, sending 3 men flying into the bone-lined walls. Claws longer than combat knives reached for another soldier. Tommy stumbled forward, his injured leg giving out. "The altar," he gasped. "Get me to the altar." "What?" No exclamation mark. I tried to grab him, but he pushed away. "It's me or all of us," he said. His face was death gray, but his eyes were clear. "I'm not making it out anyway. The creature paused, watching, waiting, like it understood. "Tommy, don't!" But he was already crawling toward the altar, the beast's head tilted, following his movement. Everyone held their breath, weapons still raised but useless. Tommy pulled himself onto the ancient stone. His blood, he was bleeding so much now, began flowing down those ancient channels. The creature moved like lightning. I had to look away. When I looked back, Tommy was gone. The creature had retreated to a high alcove, watching us with satiated eyes. Not hunting anymore. Not today. We backed out slowly, leaving behind another friend, another sacrifice. The sounds of feeding followed us up through the tunnels. Sometimes in my nightmares, they still do. We emerged from the temple tunnels into a dawn that felt years away from yesterday's sunset. Our group, now half its original size, moved like ghosts through the jungle. Nobody spoke. What could you say after watching your friend sacrifice himself to an ancient horror? The morning mist clung to the ground, turning the jungle into a dreamscape of gray shapes and shadows. We were heading back to base camp, hoping to find reinforcements, evacuation, anything. The dragon hadn't followed us, but its presence lingered like a shadow on our minds. The first sign something was wrong was the silence. No radio chatter, no distant helicopter sounds, not even the usual camp noise. Then the smell hit us. Smoke, cordite, and something worse. "Dear God," David whispered as we cleared the tree line. The camp was a slaughterhouse. Tents lay shredded, equipment scattered like broken toys. Bodies, or pieces of them, littered the ground. Some showed bullet wounds, but others had been torn apart by something with massive claws. "Check for survivors," Martinez ordered, his voice hollow. We moved through the carnage in pairs, weapons ready. The ground was soggy with blood and morning dew. Here and there, massive claw marks scored the earth and trees. A jeep had been tossed onto its side, its metal frame bent like paper. "Over here!" The shout came from what remained of the command tent. Inside, we found Sergeant Rogers and a handful of survivors. They had barricaded themselves in, using metal crates and equipment. Rogers' face was a mask of barely controlled terror. "It came at night," he reported, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. "Huge. Fucking huge. Took Johnson right out of his watchtower. After that," he shook his head. "It wasn't just killing. It was playing with us. Hunting us." I looked at the survivors' faces. They had the same haunted look I'd seen in the Vietnamese prisoners' eyes. They'd seen what we'd seen. They knew what we knew. We weren't fighting a war anymore. We were just trying to survive it. "We've got a working jeep," Rogers said, already moving. "If we can make it to Saigon." He didn't finish the thought. We all knew the dragon could easily outpace any vehicle, but it was our only chance. The survivors quickly loaded supplies while David and I helped gather ammunition. The morning sky had turned an ugly yellow-gray, like a bruise. Something was changing in the air, the same heavy feeling we'd experienced before the creature appeared. Then we heard it, that familiar leathery sound of wings. "Move! Now!" Martinez yelled. We sprinted for the jeep, but the dragon dropped from the clouds like a falling shadow, landing between us and our escape route. In daylight, it was even more terrifying. Scales shifting colors like oil on water, eyes burning with ancient malice. Rogers opened fire with an M60 machine gun, the heavy rounds sparking off the creature's hide. It turned toward him with almost lazy confidence. Too late, we realized its strategy. It had cut our group in half, separating us from the vehicle. "Get to the jeep," Rogers shouted, continuing to fire. "I'll hold it off." The dragon's tail whipped through the air, catching two men and sending them flying into the jungle. Its head snaked down, jaws opening to reveal rows of teeth like black daggers. Rogers didn't stop firing, even as the beast lunged. David and I reached the jeep with the remaining survivors. The engine roared to life, but I couldn't look away from Rogers' last stand. The dragon had him cornered, but he was laughing now, a wild, desperate sound. In his hand, I saw what looked like a grenade. "You want a meal?" he screamed. "Choke on this!" The explosion blinded us momentarily. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard the dragon's shriek of pain and rage. We didn't wait to see more. The jeep lurched forward, tires spinning in the blood-soaked mud, before finding grip. As we sped through the jungle, the sounds of fury faded behind us. But in the rearview mirror, through the trees, I caught one last glimpse of those red eyes. They seemed to say, "Go ahead, run. I am patient. I am eternal." And it was right. Because even now, years later, those eyes still find me in my dreams. The official report called it a catastrophic enemy encounter. Like somehow those 3 sanitized words could capture the horror of what happened in that jungle. They shipped us home within a week. Those of us who survived. The military doesn't like mysteries it can't explain or enemies it can't fight. The VA hospital in Austin was all fluorescent lights and disinfectant smells, so different from the temple's ancient stone and jungle rot. But sometimes, late at night, I'd wake up convinced I could smell that old death scent, hear the whisper of massive wings outside my window. Post-traumatic stress disorder, the doctors said, scribbling in their notebooks. Survivor's guilt, combat fatigue. They had so many names for what was wrong with us, but none of them came close to the truth. "Tell us about the temple again," they'd say, their voices gentle but disbelieving. So I told them, over and over, about Tommy's sacrifice, about Roger's last stand, about the creature that hunted us. Each time I told it, they nodded and wrote more notes, prescribed more pills. But I saw it in their eyes, the same look civilians get when you try to tell them what war is really like. That careful, distanced sympathy, that silent certainty that you're just another broken soldier, seeing monsters in your memories. David was the only one who understood. We'd talk on the phone late at night when the memories were too loud to sleep. "They'll never believe us," he'd say. How could they? Their world doesn't have room for dragons? He was right. So eventually I stopped telling them. Learned to nod at the right times, take the pills, say what they wanted to hear. But every night I still checked the sky for wings, and every shadow might hide those burning red eyes. Because some things follow you home from war, and some horrors don't need a passport to cross oceans. 20 years have passed since that temple in Vietnam, but the memories haven't faded. They never will. Time has a way of changing things, making some wounds heal, some scars fade. But not these. Not what we saw. Tommy's sister wrote to me last year. He's got a memorial stone in Austin, right next to his father's. The official record says he died in combat. Simple, clean. Better than trying to explain how he really died, sacrificing himself on an ancient altar to save the rest of us from something that shouldn't exist. Martinez made it home too, but the war, or what we found in it, never really left him. They found him in '95, in his garage. The note he left mentioned red eyes watching him from every shadow. Said he couldn't take the waiting anymore, knowing it was still out there, still hungry. David's the only one who turned his nightmare into something else. Got his degree in Eastern Religious Studies at Michigan. Spends his time researching ancient temples, dragon myths, trying to understand what we encountered. Sometimes he sends me his papers, full of academic language and careful theories. But between the lines, I can read the real message. He's looking for it again. Trying to prove we weren't crazy, that it was real. Me? I've learned to live with it. Most days, I can almost pretend it was just another war story. Almost. But then I'll see something on the news. A helicopter gone missing over Southeast Asia. A military patrol vanished in some jungle. And I'll know. It's still there, still hunting, still patient. The doctors have their explanations. PTSD, shared trauma response. The mind protecting itself from horrors it can't process. But they weren't there. They didn't see those ancient walls, didn't hear those wings in the dark. They never had to look into eyes older than humanity itself and know that everything they believed about the world was wrong. Sometimes, on nights when sleep won't come, I think about Mai's bookstore in Saigon. Wonder if she's still there, still warning soldiers about things that hide in the jungle, still trying to save lives with words no one wants to believe, because that's the real horror in the end. Not that monsters exist, but that they've always been there, waiting in the dark spaces of our world, watching us play at war in their territory. Patient, eternal, hungry. And somewhere in Vietnam, in an ancient temple wrapped in vines and shadows, something with wings and ancient eyes is waiting. Always waiting. For armies will always march into jungles, men will always fight wars, and dragons must feed.